Okay, welcome back to this next podcast episode, or if you're joining us on YouTube, welcome back. We are talking again with Sarita, just me and Sarita, and I have heard in person and online a couple times about her famous Maxi Pad, and you may be confused by this. This was her little, what would you say, makeshift birth center? Would you call it that?
You could call it that. It was really just a trailer in the woods.
Okay.
I started out, of course, doing home births and always had a room in my house where I did prenatals, or like it kind of includes your family that way, but for both good and bad. And then eventually, when I opened a clinic after becoming a family practice, I had a room in the back,
Mhm.
right? And people tended to call it a birth center, and I kept saying, no, 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 it's just a room in the back.
Mhm.
And then we had a number of babies born there. We set it up very much. We use home birth as the gold standard. I'll put it that to you that
Yeah,
way.
yeah.
It was not medical, even though it was in a clinic. And then as I shifted into a variety of other work environments, I needed a place to just do the midwifery part of my practice. And that turned out to be a small, single wide, two-bedroom trailer that had originally been for a family member to live in, and that was now empty. And so that family member who grew up with her mother as a midwife and had to put up with all kinds of things had already dubbed it pretty quickly the maxi pad, saying that it was long, white, and full of estrogen, which it was. So it became sort of like a girls club, the maxi pad, which really did fit the description. And we did prenatals there and we did births there. It served a purpose. People came from, a couple hours away to give birth there, driving past hospitals close to their homes, and other facilities to come up into the mountains and give birth in this trailer, behind my house. I think it really did, then what many of them would say is that it created this bubble of privacy
Mhm.
because that they knew that they had this control of this environment in a way that they didn't have to worry about neighbors. They didn't have to worry about, maybe negative family members, or they could just go off and have this little, baby moon in the woods. And so quite a few babies were born there. At one point, I did basic just counseling and not like a clinic exam, but visits there as well, when I wasn't working in other clinics. And I actually really liked that. I had somebody pull up one time who was, to be quite truthful with you, in the middle of a miscarriage, and she hadn't been able to get appropriate care from the various ERs she'd been to. They just kept telling her that it was complete when it wasn't.
Mhm.
And she pulled up. I'm cooking dinner, right? Like, because this trailer's behind my house. I'm cooking dinner, and this car pulls up, and this lady that I knew, because I'd attended many of the women in her congregation, pulls up and says, "Can you help me?" I was like, "Yeah, sure. Let me, turn the vegetables off." And I met her up at the maxi pad and found the problem and was able to, provide what she needed.
Mhm.
So there was some, there was both good and bad, but having something that wasn't in your house was kind of nice, and also having
Mhm.
something that was just, you know, I don't know how far it is, 30 yards behind your house through the trees, where it could be private was really nice for me. Couples would come and they would, this is what I'm thinking of, because I had a phone system so they could call down to my house.
Nice.
And if they wanted to labor alone, early labor or whatever, I just come on back down to my house and sleep with my phone on my pillow. And many times I woke up and be like, she's ready. Okay. And, you just zip up through the woods, um, have a baby. And then they could stay afterwards, which was really nice.
How
Um,
long would they stay typically?
Depending on the situation, and maybe as much as 24 hours, maybe
Mm.
less, depending on how close they lived, or
Mm-hmm.
how long the birth had been. We also used to call it, it was our uh was it bed, birth, and breakfast, because often we would have my husband, we would call down after the baby was born, and he's a good breakfast cook. So
Nice.
he would bring blueberry pancakes and scrambled eggs and feed everybody, which then gave him the opportunity to hold the baby, have a good excuse to hold the baby while mom ate. So it really was full service for a lot of people.
Sweet.
We did water births there. It was perfect. It was a little 42 feet long, 14 feet wide trailer that provided just enough space
Yeah.
for somebody to have their baby.
Would
I
you
was
charge extra if they birthed there?
No, no, but we'll get into that conversation about value later, huh?
Yes.
No, I didn't charge extra. In many ways, it made it easier for me because I didn't have to travel anywhere.
Oh, yeah.
Like I said, they might live a couple hours away. So being able to just sleep in my own bed and
Hmm.
go up when they needed me was really much more convenient for me, in a lot of different ways. So, yeah, we had a good time. It was fun. And then, we'd meet there, or we'd, sit around and talk, and,
Yeah. Get them
all
comfortable
that.
with the space for sure.
Right.
That's important.
Comfortable with the space. Yeah. All of my prenatals lasted at least an hour. So
Hmm.
by the time they gave birth there, they had spent enough time in the trailer for it to feel very comfortable. One of my visions, being culturally correct, was that if we really wanted to address some of the maternal problems, shortages in West Virginia, we would just have a series of little single wide trailers in all the communities. You really don't need anything more than that, with a midwife that could handle 2 or 3 towns at a time.
Hmm.
So we think of a birth center, which I never called it that, but we think of a birth center as something that needs to be formal or institutional or
Right.
office like or whatever, when really, 2 bedroom single wide trailers served quite well.
Hmm. What would you stock it with? What were your supplies?
Lots of towels, right? Lots of linens. And then we had, you know, well, I always had my birth bags packed. So my birth bags to be able to go anywhere so that
Hmm.
they stayed there or stayed right handy so that you had anything you needed packed up in those bags no matter where you went. And then, we had food and we had any extra things we could keep you know, stored away. But mostly we just always kept our supplies other than linens in those birth bags. I carried oxygen, I had like 4 or 5 different bags for different purposes.
Nice. I
Yeah.
love the vision of it. Do you have any
Yeah.
photos?
No, not anymore. Well, I will tell you this story. This was one, and I won't tell you the birth story, but it was, and I had one grandchild born in that trailer too. So that was, it got christened with some Bennett DNA. But I also did teaching clinical rotations for medical students. And I had a DO student come because she wanted specifically to learn my approach to prenatal care and my
Nice.
approach to reproduction. And the first day she was with me, we were there in the Maxi Pad doing prenatals. And after the first one, when I was showing her how to palpate, she just looked at me and said, "I've never seen somebody touch a belly like that. This is where
Mm.
I'm going to have my baby."
Yeah.
And 10 months later, she gave birth almost exactly in the same spot she was standing when she said that.
Oh,
So,
cool.
so one of the things that was nice about it was that you also did have some overlap of the people as they came and went,
Mm.
right? Like if I scheduled uh, visits every hour, then often people would get there a little early and they would get to talk to the people from before. So one of the things, even though people were from lots of different places around, was the ability to talk to other people of like mind
Hmm.
or of uh, like experience, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that was very helpful.
You said it was a 2 bedroom.
Mhm.
Was one bedroom a birthing room and one was like a prenatal office room? Or would you do prenatals in the living room area?
Well, we usually gathered in the living room, which all
Okay.
that part was open with the kitchen. I mean, and babies were born in the living room. They were born on the kitchen floor. They were born, wherever she wanted to be. There was a room that we used both for prenatals and for if because there were, I can only think of a couple people that gave birth in a bed, right? Like that wasn't, but the prenatal bed was also the postpartum bed,
Okay.
right? And that room, might be where we would set up, a birth stool. Or I used to kind of set up stations so that there'd
Mm,
be, a place you could kneel and be comfortable. There'd be a birth stool where you could sit in, whatever position. And then out in the living room, we'd have maybe the birth tub if they wanted to have, water labor, water birth. And then, wherever they wanted to go, any women, there's one in particular I can think of who tended to give birth very quickly. She was hard to read. You didn't know she was about to start pushing until she did, and she gave birth on her hands and knees on the kitchen floor, right? Yeah, which it's just like home, right? It's
yeah.
like home birth. So it wasn't a birth center; it was just a trailer where babies were born. It was
Uh-huh.
a maxi pad.
Would you bring the linens and towels up to your place to wash them, or did you have a laundry down there?
No, I washed them in my house, and I did the same thing when I had a bigger actual birth center in Virginia later on. I always did the laundry
Mhm.
myself for a number of reasons, and I don't know, that was all part of the ritual of cleaning and folding and closing,
Yeah,
the ending that experience and putting everything ready for the next one.
love it.
Yeah.
About how many birth, like it can be a rough guess if you don't have a number, but how many births did you say happened in the maxi pad?
Mm. Oh, I'd really have to think about that, right? Um, because the prenatals happen there, even if they were going to have a home birth. So
Uh-huh.
some of that's kind of jumbled up
Fuzzy in there.
in
Yeah.
my head. But we worked out of there for a couple of years.
So maybe
So
100 plus births?
no, not that many because I'm very low volume, right?
Okay.
I'm out in a very rural area. Um, no, I'd have to think about it. I tended my average until I moved to Virginia was probably 20 or so births a year, something like
Mm.
that,
Okay.
mixed in with
Yeah.
everything else, especially because when you're family practice, there's
Right.
kind of busy. Um, and uh, yeah, so I'd have to think about that number, but it was fairly constant strain there for a while. It was very
Cool.
comfortable. Yeah, it was fun.
Did you ever do classes, group classes in there?
No, I haven't done group classes in a long time.
Mm.
That's how I started actually, early in my midwifery path was really starting to do childbirth education classes. Um, but I really began to do more of bringing that education into each prenatal visit so that that hour we spent together each time was the foundation of
Yeah.
childbirth education, individualized to what they needed. And then I had recommendations for certain books or videos, and I always had a book library for them to borrow from. And I always try to prepare them. All right, next time this is going to be the issue we're going to talk about, so go ahead and research it so that you can come back
Mhm.
and have a basic understanding that we can go from there. Right.
Nice.
Yeah.
I I want to chat with Rowan soon about her Asheville house. She
Hmm.
has running this community house, and it's a beautiful story, very similar to um, what community work you were doing
Hmm.
in certain aspects.
Hmm.
So
Different kind of community.
yes.
Either way, though, here's what I will say, here as we finish. Whether it was at the clinic or it was here at the Maxi Pad or it was at home, the official, like the hospital here in Pocahontas County, hasn't provided any kind of maternity services for 40 years, right? Like the
Mhm.
last baby's born, I was born there, like it's been a long time since babies were born in this county. And we're very isolated and at least an hour to an hour and a half, depending on traffic, um, away from any obstetrical unit, right? So people here are very limited in their options, and induction is used as an excuse so that because they live far away, kind of
Right.
thing, right? So one of the things I really saw as people began to have their babies within the borders of this county again was some sense of pride, especially from the grandparents, of my descendants were born back
Mhm.
here again, especially from people that were local people.
Yeah.
So it began to really impress upon me, which I knew, but I really saw how those community ties begin with that,
Mhm.
right? When we take birth out of the community, we lose something that bonds us together and gives us all some um, uh, collective hope for the future.
So then where was your mind's processing of we're attending births so far away from the hospital? Where did you go with that?
I mean, from home births or at the clinic or
Well, both. I mean, we all do this. We all will attend births. That most of us will attend births that are quite a ways from hospitals. So,
Mhm.
was this an extra conversation? Was this you took different precautions? You did or didn't do certain things?
Well, it was a different, yes, all of that. Yes. Both it was a different conversation. It was a different way of assessing things, right? You learned, and this is why I can say this so clearly. If you're going to do an intervention, be ready for the next one. And do you have the resources? Because when you're an hour and a half away, you might not, right?
Mhm.
So you don't do things. You really study physiology and you don't do things that don't have to be done, and everything is aimed at not screwing up normal because you don't want to have to do the next intervention, and understanding that when you're assessing this situation you also have to count in your timeline that you're going to have at least an hour and a half drive to a hospital, and so you don't want to not be stable when you leave on that drive. You want to still be stable throughout that drive. So it's a different way of assessing things. It's a way of knowing that if you're going to intervene, you better be ready for the next complication, not to intervene if you're not ready. And it really is because I gave birth that far away, right? Like I live here. It really is a commitment
Mhm.
to your sovereignty because you know that there's no, like savior mentality, for lack of a
Mhm.
better way to put it, you are responsible for being healthy and you are responsible for making those decisions in a way um, that you accept those outcomes, right?
Mhm.
That you only have so many tools that you can use,
Right, exactly.
right? It's a commitment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I yeah, that's good. I appreciate it. Thank you,
Mhm.
Sarita. Any
You're
last things you
welcome.
want to add?
I can't think of anything. Thanks for asking the questions. It's I always tell people, I will finish with this. It's okay to be afraid, but let's be afraid of the right things.
Right. And you're doing it this afraid. You're doing it full knowing. You're
Right,
knowing the sides.
right,
You're knowing the physiology, asking the questions, not doing it blindly.
right. Exactly. Exactly. You know what you're doing, and the any risks that you're taking, you've accepted.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
That's right. Okay. We'll talk later. Thank you,
Yep.
Sarita.
Thanks. Bye.